somewhere in Babylon, in a flat alluvial plain where no mountains exist and never have. There once stood a structure approximately 90 meters tall. Not 90 meters as a symbolic claim, as a physical measurement. The Esagilla tablet, a cuneiform document now held in the Louvre, written in the Seleucid period, gives the precise dimensions of the structure's base, 91.5 by 91.5 meters, with 7 tiers rising to a summit temple. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting Babylon in the 5th century BCE, described it in his histories. A tower of immense size, built in stages, with a spiral path ascending to the summit. At the top, he wrote, was a temple with a great couch and a golden table, where, according to the Babylonian priests, the god Marduk would descend and rest. The Babylonians called it Anunnaki. The name translates as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. Not a metaphor, a functional description. This structure was understood by the people who built it, maintained it, and performed rituals in it for centuries, as the physical point where the cosmic and earthly orders met. The place where heaven touched ground. You probably know it by a different name. The Tower of Babel. And here is what I find genuinely interesting. Not the mystical claims, not the ancient aliens angle, not the conspiracy theory version of this story, but the actual documented fact. The same building, the same physical structure of brick and bitumen in Babylon, meant completely different things to the two civilizations who wrote about it. And the difference between those meanings tells you something important about how history gets rewritten, when one civilization's sacred architecture is filtered through another civilization's theology. The ziggurat form, the tiered, stepped temple platform, was one of the defining architectural achievements of Mesopotamian civilization. The word comes from the Akkadian zikwaratu, meaning to build high or to be raised up. Every major Sumerian and Babylonian city had one: Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Babylon. They were not temples in the sense we typically understand. They were not spaces where congregations gathered for worship. They were platforms, elevated sacred precincts at the summit of which stood a small temple, often called the Jugunu, the Holy of Holies. The architectural logic is explicit in Mesopotamian religious texts. The universe was structured in layers, the earthly realm at the base, ascending through successive celestial spheres to the highest heaven of the god Anu. The ziggurat physically replicated this structure. Each tier represented a cosmic level. The external staircases, which at some ziggurats rose in 3 separate flights, each from a different direction, were not architectural decoration. They were the physical means of ascending from earth toward the divine. At Anunnaki in Babylon, the 7 tiers were each associated with one of the 7 known celestial bodies: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Ancient sources describe each tier painted a different color corresponding to its planetary association: black for Saturn, orange for Mercury, red for Mars, gold for the Sun. Herodotus reports that at the summit, the small temple was maintained with a furnished bed, a golden table, and regular offerings of food and drink. The priests told him that the god himself descended there to rest. Not in the metaphorical sense that gods dwell in temples. Herodotus was specific that the Babylonian priests claimed literal divine visitation. Whether the Babylonian priests believed this literally or whether it was ritual language describing a theological reality, is a question the clay tablets cannot definitively answer. What is clear, the structure was designed, in the architectural and ritual logic of its builders, as a point of contact between the divine and earthly orders. The Hebrew account of the same building, or at least the same tradition, appears in Genesis 11. The passage is brief. Humanity, speaking one language, settles in the plain of Shinar, the Hebrew name for Babylonia, and decides to build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. God observes this and says, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." God then confuses their language, they stop building, and scatter across the earth. The structure in Genesis is a tower meant to reach heaven. The narrative frames this as human hubris, the arrogance of trying to force access to the divine through engineering. God's intervention is a correction of human overreach. This is the version of the story that most people in the Western tradition have received. The tower as symbol of pride. The confusion of languages as punishment. But this is not how Mesopotamian sources describe their own monument. The Sumerian and Babylonian texts that describe ziggurats, including Etemenanki specifically, frame them not as human attempts to reach upward, but as structures designed to invite divine descent. The platforms were not stairways for humans climbing toward heaven. They were landing zones for gods descending to earth. The difference is complete. In the Mesopotamian original, a sacred structure built to restore contact between heaven and earth, with priests ascending to perform rituals of welcome. In the Hebrew retelling, a monument to human arrogance abandoned when God scattered the builders. What happened between these two accounts is what happens whenever one civilization's sacred architecture gets interpreted through another civilization's theological framework. The original meaning inverts. The structure that was built to call the gods down becomes the structure built in defiance of them. Etemenanki's history is substantially documented. The earliest significant structure on the site likely dates to the 2nd millennium BCE. The ziggurat that Herodotus describes was rebuilt extensively by Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE and whose inscription on a clay cylinder now in the Louvre describes the structure in his own words. "I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to heaven." Nebuchadnezzar also restored the Esagila, the temple complex adjacent to Etemenanki dedicated to Marduk. The dimensions in the Esagila tablet give each tier's height, the base 33 meters, then successive tiers diminishing in height but not in complexity. The total structure, by the tablet's measurements, reached approximately 90 meters. This would have made it visible for roughly 50 kilometers across the flat Babylonian plain, a man-made mountain in a landscape where no natural elevation exceeded a few meters. Alexander the Great visited Babylon in 323 BCE and reportedly planned to rebuild Etemenanki, which by then had partially collapsed. He ordered the demolition of the existing structure to prepare for reconstruction, but died before the project could begin. His death effectively ended the rebuilding plans, and the structure was never restored. By the Hellenistic period, it was already in ruins. What remains today? The foundation hole. The excavation of the site in the early 20th century by Robert Coldwell identified the base as a square, approximately 91 meters on each side. The fired brick and bitumen construction that Nebuchadnezzar described is confirmed by the archaeological record. The structure itself is gone, its bricks almost certainly recycled by later builders for centuries, the characteristic behavior of mud brick architecture in Mesopotamia. The Genesis account places the Tower of Babel in the plain of Shinar, the Hebrew name for Babylonia. It describes workers using brick and bitumen, brick for stone and slime for mortar, which is precisely the construction technology of Mesopotamian ziggurats, where fired brick sealed with bitumen replaced the stone available in most other ancient building traditions. This is a specific technical detail that aligns the biblical tower with the Babylonian architectural tradition. Most contemporary scholars identify Etemenanke as the historical basis for the Tower of Babel narrative. The Hebrew Bible was substantially edited and compiled during and after the Babylonian exile, the period from 597 to 539 BCE, when significant portions of the Judean population were forcibly relocated to Babylon. Jewish exiles would have seen Etemenanke. They would have watched it being maintained, rituals being performed on its stairways, offerings carried to its summit. When they wrote about it or incorporated existing oral traditions about it, they interpreted what they saw through their own theological framework. A God who demanded monotheistic worship, who was suspicious of human self-aggrandizement, and whose relationship with humanity was covenantal rather than architectural. In that framework, a structure built to invite a god to descend becomes a structure built to presumptuously force access to God's domain. This is not falsification. It is interpretation. Every culture interprets the artifacts and monuments of other cultures through its own frameworks. But when one interpretation becomes canonical, when the Genesis version becomes the version that 16 centuries of European civilization treats as the definitive account, the original Babylonian meaning effectively disappears from general knowledge. The Tower of Babel that most people know is the Hebrew reinterpretation of a Babylonian sacred structure. The actual Babylonian understanding of Etemenanke as a carefully engineered point of cosmic contact, maintained by priests over centuries, rebuilt by one of the most powerful kings of the ancient world, is substantially less familiar. There is a further dimension to this story that belongs entirely to the realm of verified scholarship, not speculation. The Sumerian myth of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, one of the oldest Sumerian literary compositions, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, includes a passage that appears to describe a time before linguistic diversity. Once upon a time there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, no fear, no terror. Man had no rival. In those days, the lands of Suba and Amazi, harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of the Me of lordship, Uri, a land that has all that is appropriate, the land Martu, resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue gave praise. This Sumerian text describes a primordial time of unified language, then specifically says that Enki, the god of wisdom, changed the speech of humanity. The diversity of languages in this account is not punishment for hubris. It is a divine decision, made for reasons the text does not entirely clarify. The parallel to the Genesis account is striking. Both describe a primordial single language, both describe its dissolution into multiple languages, both locate this event in Mesopotamia, and both attribute it to divine agency. The Sumerian version predates the Genesis account by at least 1,000 years. This does not mean the Genesis account borrowed directly from the Sumerian. But it does indicate that the tradition of a primordial unified language and its loss was a feature of Mesopotamian religious thought that preceded and likely influenced the Hebrew tradition. The Tower of Babel story may be, in part, a Hebrew retelling of a Sumerian mythological concept, filtered through the specific architectural reality of Etemenanke. Etemenanke was demolished for its bricks. Its fired Babylonian brick, sealed with bitumen, was too useful to leave standing in a landscape that had no natural stone. The structure that Nebuchadnezzar called the wonder of the world, that Herodotus described with awe, that Alexander planned to rebuild, was taken apart piece by piece and used to build other things. This is how most of ancient Mesopotamia ends, not in dramatic conquest or volcanic catastrophe, but in the patient repurposing of materials by later inhabitants who needed brick more than they needed monuments. What survives is the foundation whole, a Louvre tablet with dimensions, Herodotus's description, Nebuchadnezzar's inscription, and the Genesis account, which is to say, the survival of the structure depends. The Babylonians built in brick because that was what they had. The Egyptians built in stone, which is why their monuments survive and Mesopotamia's do not. The most sophisticated civilization of the ancient world, the one that invented writing and the 60-minute hour and the mathematical foundations of modern astronomy, left behind clay that dissolves and brick that gets recycled. And what endures from Etemenanke is the story told by people who were not its builders. The Tower of Babel is the Hebrew interpretation of a Babylonian sacred structure, preserved in a text that was canonized into two of the world's major religions. The original Babylonian understanding survives in academic literature and museum tablets. The question of which account won is not really a question. You already know the answer. I want to be direct about what this script is and is not. The document it is based on uses real archaeological and linguistic facts, the Sumerian king list, the language isolate, the flood layers, Etemenanke, as a foundation for conclusions that mainstream scholarship does not support. Ancient astronauts, pre-flood advanced civilizations, the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials, the Baghdad battery as evidence of ancient electricity. I am not writing those conclusions into this script. I have written about what is actually documented. Etemenanke existed, its dimensions are recorded, Herodotus described it, Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it, the Genesis account is plausibly connected to it, the Sumerian myth of unified language predates Genesis by 1,000 years. What I find genuinely interesting about this material, and what I think gets lost when it gets filtered through the ancient aliens framework, is the interpretive story. The same building meant completely different things to two different civilizations. One built it as an invitation for divine descent. The other wrote about it as a monument to human hubris. Neither account is false exactly. Both are real responses to a real structure. But only one account survived into common knowledge. That gap between what a civilization understood about its own monuments and what later civilizations said about them is where I think the most honest historical inquiry lies. Not in speculation about who built the pyramids, but in the careful attention to what was actually said, by whom, and in what context. Anunnaki is rubble. Its bricks are in other buildings. The foundation hole is still in Babylon. And what we know about it comes almost entirely from people who were not its builders. That is the actual mystery.